I'm Ashton Addison from Blockwest Capital for Investment Pitch Media, and today on the Crypto Coin Show we have Andrew Beal, the ecosystem lead at Forta Network. Andy, welcome to the show, and thank you for taking the time.
Thanks for having me, Addison.
You're very welcome, man. Let's dive into Forta Network, what you're working on, and looking at the intricacies of blockchain. And I feel like there's a lot to dive into, especially with the recent news in the industry right now, where maybe Forta could come in handy for diving into the secrets of what has happened in cryptocurrency. There's a lot to unpack still that we don't know about, and I feel like some of these investigative technologies will be on the forefront of uncovering there's what people say and then there's what they do, and the blockchain never lies about transactions. So let's start off our conversation with just a high-level overview of what you and your team are working at Forta Network, and then we'll dive into all the details.
Sure. Yeah, happy to sort of introduce Forta at a high level, and excited to dive in. Because Web3 security is, I think, one of the bigger challenges and also opportunities in the space right now. So Forta Network is basically a giant public security camera and alarm system for Web3, for DeFi and NFTs. Those are the two kind of primary, I guess, asset classes or verticals that kind of make up Web3 right now. So diving a little bit deeper into sort of what do you mean by a giant security camera and alarm system for Web3? So Forta's a network that sits on top of DeFi and sits on top of NFT and is sort of looking down and watching all this on-chain activity happen, right? Because everything in these ecosystems is happening on-chain, right? The protocols are on-chain, the assets are on-chain, the trades are on-chain. Just to differentiate that from things like, Coinbase and FTX and a lot of these centralized exchange operators, right, where most of all the trading activity is happening off-chain. So everything in DeFi is on-chain, and the Forta Network collectively is watching all of that and looking for suspicious activity, malicious activity, anomalous activity, and emitting alerts about all of that. And I think the unique thing about Forta is that the Forta Foundation team, who I work for, we don't dictate what is being watched. The protocol teams, individual developers, security teams, etc., are running bots, which are sort of the vehicle for monitoring. Think about bots like a little virtual security camera that you're running on Forta, running on the Forta network, and that is what is sort of watching on-chain activity. So protocol teams publish a bunch of bots on the network that watch their own contracts, that watch their own transaction activity. People publish bots on the network that monitor other protocol activity that they're interested in. And collectively, we kind of have this, it creates this kind of giant shared security camera and alarm system that everybody in the ecosystem can benefit from. So
Very
I'll pause
cool.
there and looking forward to diving in.
Yeah, I feel like there could be multiple goals that you could attain with this kind of technology. On one hand, I see a defensive approach, obviously looking for malicious activity or fraudulent funds. If there was a hack somewhere, where's that money moving to? But on the other hand, I also see you could use this technology to see where funds are going, to take advantage of, if there's legitimate funds moving into a protocol, you could follow and track that and take advantage from a trading aspect. So what are sort of the main goals that the end users of Forta Network are getting out of using this technology?
Yeah, well, the mission behind Forta is to protect Web3 and make it a safe place for both retail and institutional participants. And it was born out of the circumstances that unfortunately kind of we're still in the middle of, which is there are very frequent and very large exploits of DeFi protocols, right? And there's multiple reasons for this. One of them is that a lot of protocols are fairly unproven and untested, and yet still responsible for holding a lot of customer funds, right? Despite going through an audit and things like that. Another challenge is that I think it's a little bit of a, we like to sort of compare like Web3 and Web2, but the reality is that all of these DeFi projects, these sort of Web3 sort of native projects, all have Web2 components to them. They all have front ends, they all have applications, they all have APIs, they all use like oftentimes Amazon Web Services and Cloudflare and a lot of these sort of traditional web services. And these are all, and they all have access controls and sometimes private key management requirements. And these are all things that existed with internet businesses pre-crypto, right? And these are also all attack vectors for a hacker too, right? And so a lot of the hacks that happen in Web3 are because these Web2 components aren't secured properly, right? So that's another big area of security that I think that in general we can do a lot better at. And then the third is I think most projects today, let's pick a DeFi project, like most DeFi projects today, certainly let's say this is definitely true a year ago, the extent of their kind of security plan was to get one or more audits before they launched their protocol, and then once it was live they would put a bug bounty in place, and that was often it. They wouldn't do anything else. And there are two other big pieces of kind of the security stack that were just being ignored, which is real-time monitoring, which is where Forta comes in, right? Watching your system in real time and looking for, actually, like not waiting for a threat to be, not waiting for you to be notified by a threat by someone in your community on Twitter or Telegram, which is how it often gets reported, right? But actually being proactive and like trying to identify those things ahead of time as they're happening and then reacting to it quickly. And those two pieces of kind of the Web3 security stack are very, very immature. And so anyway, Forta is addressing this real-time monitoring kind of component and threat detection. But the other half is like, once you detect something, what do you do about it, right? And so that's another kind of conversation that I think the industry needs to talk about a lot more. There's a lot of things we can do. Very few of them are actually happening right now. But I'm really optimistic that that's going to change over the next couple of years. So that, I guess that was a roundabout way of kind of setting up my answer to your question, which is what kind of value are users getting from the Forta network? So Forta is, again, the network collectively is watching everything on chain, and we monitor the 7 largest EVM chains today. So Ethereum, Binance Chain, Polygon, Arbitrum, Optimism, Phantom, etc. And watching everything in real time, looking for threats, looking for anomalies, looking for suspicious activity, and then alerting those teams and those communities about it so that they can do something, right? Again, I think the security camera and alarm system analogy is a really good one. So that's the value, right? We're delivering real-time intelligence to a protocol team, a hedge fund, an exchange, a trader, anyone that has contracts on chain or has exposure to those contracts or assets on chain. That wants this intelligence so that they can take some action based on it, right? And it could be defensive, it could be offensive, as you mentioned. But that's our immediate goal, and that's what we're really focused on.
That's great to hear. When you can save anybody from getting hacked, hopefully before it happens, then that's a green check for DeFi and a move in the right direction. And over the years, it has gotten better. Whenever there's an exploit in something, then normally that's patched and then that sets a precedent. Like we should always take into account this issue that happened before. But there seems to be new things coming up, and as DeFi is continuing to expand in new directions, new kind of exploits happen. And last month in October, it was actually a record for DeFi hacks. There was 4 or 5 different hacks that totaled almost $800 million across different blockchains as well. Some of them I believe you're following, and some of them maybe your team isn't following. But can you talk about what happened last month, and was Forta Network involved in identifying any issues in these DeFi hacks?
So I guess without diving kind of into any of the hacks specifically, yes, there were certain exploits that were aspects of them were detected by Forta. And I'll kind of break this down a little bit for folks listening. So a lot of the threat monitoring that's running on Forta. So a lot of the, think about like, we have there's a group of kind of bots, or AKA like little virtual security cameras running on the Forta network that are watching for certain things. So we have bots that are protocol specific that are watching, MakerDAO and Lido and Compound and Aave, etc. But we also have bots that are just looking for generic sort of threat activity. And what we're looking for is based on patterns that we've seen in previous exploits. Mm-hmm. So for example, a lot of exploits start with a withdrawal out of Tornado Cash because the hacker has like obfuscated the source of the funds that they're going to use to pay for gas fees and other things. So that's the first kind of red flag, right, that you're looking for. And then the next step that a hacker often takes is they take those funds that have been obfuscated through a privacy protocol like Tornado Cash, and they deploy them with a new smart contract on chain, and that's going to be the attacker contract that they're going to execute the exploit from. So when we see those two activities in that order, right, when we see that basic pattern of activity, that's kind of the first clue for us that there's an attack that's being set up. And there's a lot of other sort of complementary factors that red flags that we can look for, other kind of what I'll call like signatures of exploit activity that we're also looking for in real time. And then the network's emitting alerts about that. And what we're getting better at is identifying who the victim is or is intended to be. We're pretty good now at identifying obviously who the attacker is, but the real value is identifying who the victim's going to be or who the victim is. So that's something that our community is working on right now as well. And like I said, there have been instances where Forta has generated, one or more alerts about something that's an attack that's in progress. Now the reality is that for those to be beneficial, the team that is being exploited need to be receiving those alerts, right? So if a team's not using Forta, then they're not getting this intel, right? So that's one sort of reality. The second reality is that even if teams are receiving Forta alerts, they need to have the ability to respond quickly once they get that alert, right? You got to be able to react, sometimes in seconds, right? And unfortunately, most teams don't have the ability to do that. They either don't have someone watching for that alert 24/7, right? Depending on time zones, and it can be challenging. And then oftentimes, a team's only sort of mechanism for responding to a threat is to pause the protocol. I think some folks who are listening may have heard of a pause button, which is a feature that's baked into a lot of smart contracts that will allow you to sort of temporarily kind of bring down the system in response to a threat or a vulnerability that's identified, right? And the challenge is that actually initiating that pause process usually requires a multi-sig that you need to organize, get up to speed, and then you all need to sign transactions, and then you can sort of officially pause the protocol. And so that process is very time consuming. It's not fast enough to usually prevent an exploit. So this is kind of what I was alluding to earlier when I said that threat detection is getting better, but threat prevention is really where the industry needs to make a lot of investments, because the mechanisms that we have for prevention today aren't fast enough. They're not sufficient. So we're thinking a lot about, and I know a lot of other teams are thinking about, kind of where in the tech stack should we be sort of screening for malicious transactions or high-risk transactions, right? The same way that sort of a bank will screen for high-risk transactions today, right? Ashton, if you walk into a bank and you want to cash $1 million check, like the bank is not going to give you $1 million cash and let you walk out, right? They may give you a little bit based on how much money you have in your account, but then they're gonna hold the rest of that money to make sure that that check clears, right? They want to avoid that check bouncing, right, and them being liable for that. So that doesn't happen with DeFi protocols today, right? DeFi protocols are kind of, it's a one-stop, it's a one-size-fits-all. As long as your transaction is technically valid, it will be processed, and it doesn't take into account risk, right? And so I think that concept of kind of screening for risky transactions, either at the like L1 level when you're building blocks, or at the protocol level where protocols themselves are determining like what transactions I'm going to let through to my system or not. Both of those are sort of, I think, worth spending a lot more time thinking about. So that, anyway, that's where I think the security conversation is moving, and I think we're going to see a lot of cool developments there.
Fascinating. And with the news this week of FTX becoming insolvent and centralized exchanges, you mentioned at the beginning about how often a lot of these exchanges, the transactions that are going on the exchange are sort of off-chain. And although it shows your balance of 5 Bitcoin on your account, it doesn't necessarily mean there's that exact 5 Bitcoin in a blockchain wallet that's attached to your account. And these centralized exchanges are often probably using your money on the back end, moving it around, making money off of it at the same time. And with what it appears with FTX, is that they didn't have 100% reserves of the funds of the users' funds that were in the exchange, but at the same time there are funds somewhere, and those could be tracked on the blockchain if you know where their cold wallets are and how they're moving funds around. And there are not just mismanagement of funds, but there have been a lot of hacks in centralized exchanges as well. Do you think that this technology could have prevented or made centralized exchanges better as well?
So I think it's a great question. I mean, I'll preface my answer by saying that I think a lot of the issues that we're sort of dealing with this week, in response to FTX and Alameda, are a result of sort of poor risk management internally at these companies. Poor risk management or no risk management. The use of the not following what I consider to be sort of just a kind of a day one sort of rule, which is always maintain a 1-to-1 reserve with your customer deposits, right? Fractional reserves are sort of that's the death knell for any exchange, and there's been exchanges in sort of crypto history that have obviously not done this, and they've and imploded as a result. So I would have thought that we were past sort of that, but clearly not. And then just not having a lot of sophistication around kind of the financial reporting and audit functions, right? I just saw a tweet today from SBF that just said, he claims to be very unaware of, kind of the state of their books and liquidity and all those things. And that just shows you kind of a complete breakdown in internal financial reporting, which you would think of with a company that size, right? They would have invested in, sort of cleaning that up, but that wasn't the case. So I think there's a lot of issues there that Forta wouldn't have been able to address, right? Just sort of internal company processes and controls that didn't exist, or if they did exist, they weren't sufficient or being followed. So that's the big thing. I think where Forta can, to the extent that there were on-chain signals that would have given the industry some more insight into maybe how funds were moving between these two entities, or trading activity, right? To the extent that it was on chain, Forta could have, Forta potentially could have caught that. But again, someone would have had to like deployed bots on the network that are monitoring for those specific things, right? So, someone would have needed to have thought about that and then developed a bot accordingly, or a group of them, and then deployed those on chain and made those alerts, public for everyone to see, right? But I think it's a really interesting sort of, it's a really interesting thought, because I expect, long term, and we're already kind of seeing this, right? Like, this is all DeFi in particular, right? It's all public infrastructure, and right now the people who care the most about that are like the core dev team responsible for that protocol, right? And then after them, it's the people who have exposure to that protocol, right? The retail investors or institutional investors that are using that protocol for lending or swaps or whatever, right? But there's a big pool of stakeholders outside of those two groups that can also, that also care about that, right? And it could be other teams that are building on top of your protocol, right? There's a lot of composability in DeFi, right? And so there's a lot of dependency upstream and downstream for other contracts, right? Oracles is a great example, right? Of sort of third-party dependencies that exist. And so you not only need to be paying attention to your own stuff, but you need to be watching other things that you have that you're dependent on, right? That if they break, it has a downstream effect on your system, right? And so, and that level of kind of monitoring just doesn't really exist today in the space. So that's one thing that, I think Forta can really enable, is just sort of this, we can bring a lot of public transparency to how these protocols at least operate, and the health of them and the security of them sort of block to block. And I think it's important to regulators, it's important to lawmakers, it's important to people who are integrating and building things on top of systems like that, and it's also important to the core teams that are maintaining them.
Very well said, Andy. And as DeFi continues to grow and into the next bull cycle, whenever that does happen, I feel like this technology will be very important to ensure the safety and security of people's funds in DeFi and in smart contracts, and with NFTs as well, in the many industries that they will expand into beyond the finance world. So thank you so much for the insights. What is the best way for people to learn more about Forta Network and follow along with the updates with your team? Yeah.
So you can learn more about Forta at forta.org, forta.org, and you can follow us on Twitter at Forta Network. We regularly post, we regularly host Twitter Spaces. So if you're interested in sort of, learning more about kind of the bleeding edge of Web3 security, every 2 weeks or so, we have a great roundtable discussion, usually on Twitter. So keep an eye out for those. And if anyone has any questions, they can also reach out to me directly. I'm at AJ Beal on Twitter.
Sounds great, Andy. And I will leave those links in the description box below as well. Thank you for your insights into the industry. All the best with Forta Network moving forward, and let's follow up in the near future.
Thanks, Ashton.